Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I've been asked to introduce myself because my name is kind of hard to say. So I'm Maïté Jauregui-Naudin. I'm working with IFRI, the French Institute of International Relations, with a think tank based in France. So first I would like to thank the Becker Institute and the French Consulate in Houston for giving us the opportunity to debate of these important issues this afternoon. So this morning we listened very interesting comments on how the balance between security of supplies, competitiveness, and the fight against climate change was difficult to reach. And our session this afternoon will speak more particularly on the policies that are implemented on the local, national, and international level. So to explore this topic, we will successively hear three talented experts. So first we will hear Mr. Bumpers, who has been involved with climate change issues for 12 years. And he's a partner and head of the global climate change practice at Baker Botts LLP. Then we will listen Mr. Turner, Deputy Director at the Office of Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then we will listen Mr. Sass, Fellow of the Global Climate Change at the James Baker Institute and the Harry and Olga Weiss. And he shares the Nobel Prize as a member of the IPCC with Al Gore. Before to give them the floor, I just would like to share with you a few comments on French and European policies. Since we spoke a little about that this morning, but just to illustrate how difficult it is to have commitments and objectives on one side and to try to reach them. So in France lately, there has been a very strong will to push the climate change on very high on the agenda on both national and European level. In France, the French Parliament voted a couple of weeks ago the Grenelle de l'environnement. Le Grenelle de l'environnement is a set of environmental objectives pretty much in line with what is included in the European Energy and Climate Package. I'm just going to highlight two examples. First, we have a renewable objective that set up to 23% the part of renewable energy as part of final energy consumption. Currently, this number is around 10% and is mostly composed of hydro and, for a little part, biomass. Today in France, I guess that we reach a full capacity of hydro. So that means that the difference between this few percent of final energy consumption and the 23% is going to be will have to be carried out by solar energy, wind energy, and biomass. So this will represent a huge effort to accomplish by 2020. Second, the Grenelle de l'environnement acknowledges the necessity to divide by 4 the GHG emissions by 2050, in line with the recommendations of the IPCC. With regard to French energy mix and the fact that nuclear power is mainly the source of our electricity production, this means that we will have to produce enormous effort to divide by 4 these emissions. A recent study estimated, for example, that dividing by 2.6 GHG emissions will be extremely difficult, but still feasible economically. Beyond these long-term targets, which denotes a strong will of the French policies to act against the climate change, we might regret the lack of short-term reduction emission targets that could be tested inside or within political cycles, because a target at 2020 might not be enough. People won't be here to be evaluated on these commitments. And this remark remains true beyond France's borders, of course. On the European level, you might have witnessed all the debate around the European Energy and Climate Package. So the EU ETS is the main tool of Europe in the fight against climate change. it proved to be functioning, but it still has to make the proof to be efficient in terms of substantial reduction of CO2 emission, at least on a larger scale. And the energy and climate package that has been voted last Friday was supposed to strengthen this market. So it's true that the objectives, the commitments of reducing the emissions by 20% remains true. But still, I mean, we have to give the means to the industrial and to all the actors involved to be able to reach this target. And in the current context, with regard to the financial crisis, European politicians stepped back, and part of the package has been watered down. So concession has been made toward Poland and other countries that relies on coal for their electricity production. No full auctioning either for the industries that are exposed to international competitions. And at last, the revenues from the auctions will be affected on a voluntary basis to research and development on clean technologies. So enough for me now. I will now turn to the panel to give them time to discuss the topic of our session, and we will listen first Mr. Bumpers, who has some radical ideas to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And hello all, and thank you for having me here. I guess one correction, regrettably, I've been doing this more than 12 years. In fact, you know, I've been doing it so long, I used to be known as that young guy who had those climate ideas. I actually was at the Baker Institute's Global Energy Risk Conference in London about a month ago, and it was global energy risk, and we were talking about oil prices and oil supply and peak oil and things of that nature. And what was really quite interesting, I was going to be the one person to talk about climate change and the impact of the U.S. climate policy on global energy demand. And it was sort of stunning to me. I don't know, Amy may have a different perspective, but the conference really became dominated by talk about climate change and the effect of climate policies on global energy supplies and demand. And what a number of very learned speakers concluded, including those from a number of major oil companies, is that we're likely to see peak oil demand long before we see peak supply. And I think that's absolutely true. And as you hear more and more about the policies that are coming and the exigencies of trying to address climate change, I am fully convinced that that's going to be the case, and much sooner than we even think about hitting peak oil. I guess one prerogative I'd like to take. Let me, for those of you who are not fully versed in climate change, give you one quick suggested reading list. The first one is an old book by a great historian, Barbara Tuchman, who wrote The March of Folly, from Troy to Vietnam. So a wonderful book, has nothing to do with climate change, but what it does have to do is chronicling a series of failed decision-making processes in which, from Troy to Vietnam, and she covers a number of other notable instances, the leaders of the countries or the governments at issue fail to make enlightened decisions in the face of overwhelming evidence and arguments in favor of one decision. So, you know, the Trojans just couldn't resist their greedy desires to have this great prize, even though all of the generals were saying, you can't trust those Greeks. Don't do that. And anyway, it's a great book, gives you great perspective, and I think we're at a point in which, do we not take some very aggressive decisions, it will be another grand folly. The other one is, and you know, take this earnestly, read Al Gore's Earth in the Balance. Not his new book, but the one he wrote about 15 years ago. It's a great book in which, before he was thinking he was going to be president and win a Nobel Prize, he started writing about this issue, and it's a really fine book. And the last one is the more recent one, which many of you I'm sure have seen, is Paul Friedman's Hot, Flat, and Crowded. It's a really, I mean, Friedman is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer. He's an excellent writer, and I don't agree with all of his prescriptions and conclusions, but let me just say it's a really good book. Please advance slides using keyboard below. Okay. Here's what I'd like to try to touch on today. Well, where are we? Yeah. The idea is to talk about proposed federal legislation, a little bit about regional and state programs in the U.S., the likelihood of either harmonization or preemption of those state programs when we have federal legislation, and then lastly touch it to the extent we can on how to harmonize the international regimes that are out there or will be out there. This is a chart that shows all of the major climate legislation that has been introduced in the U.S. in the past 3 years. It's interesting, the sort of the two that I'll talk about. One is the dotted red line, which is the Dingell-Boucher bill that has not even been introduced. It's actually in a draft format, but it is nonetheless the most thoughtful and thoroughly thought through legislation that's out there, and it probably will be introduced early in the next Congress. The other, which is this purple line down here, is the bill that Henry Waxman, who just took over the chairmanship of the House Energy and Commerce Committee from Chairman Dingell, former Chairman Dingell, introduced last year. And it is also a bill that Barbara Boxer, who's the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, has said she's going to introduce streamlined legislation, which originally she was a co-sponsor of this bill, is likely to look like. And what we're going to see over the next few months is a grand debate, and we heard some of this, about what are the policies within which we get on this path. I mean, this is 2012 through 2050. And the idea is, are we going to get to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, or are we going to get to 70% below 1990 levels by 2050? And the reality is from an environmental standpoint, whether we're here or here in 2050 really doesn't matter. It's at less than 5 parts per million to the atmosphere cumulatively over that entire period of time. What matters is what policies are we going to adopt to put us on this downward slope somewhere in this region that is economically and politically sustainable. And those are two critical concepts, politically and economically. There was a lot of discussion in the prior panel, which I enjoyed, about, gee, should we do this with the tax? And the answer is, that's not going to happen. It's a good academic discussion, and it's irrelevant to the political debate. We don't know what price is necessary to put us on that path, and the last thing Congress wants to do, any Congress wants to do, is to come back repeatedly and tinker with a tax when people are already smarting from an increased price of their electric bills and their gasoline prices, and jack that price up more because people aren't reacting well enough. So you can put the idea of addressing this through a global carbon tax just out of your mind. That will not happen. We may see taxes as a component of federal legislation. I actually am a fan and think it makes sense probably to address transportation fuels in addition to the renewable fuel standard that already applies and the CAFE standard that already applies to automobiles, to see a gasoline tax perhaps. But you're not going to see a tax supplant cap and trade for all of the point sources that we're dealing with. And that's okay, because if you take the electric industry plus the large industrials, the steel mills, cement manufacturers, primary metals, et cetera, that's about 43% of total U.S. emissions. And then if you get the transportation sector addressed through some sort of a tax between the renewable fuel standard, which is 20% by 2023, and the CAFE standard, which is a 25% improvement, and you address the remaining part through a tax, you're really not having to deal with a whole lot of additional carbon there. So let's talk about the Dingell-Boucher discussion draft. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about this, other than to say it is a cap and trade program. It would cover 80% of all of the emissions in the U.S., or 88% of all the emissions in the U.S., and it would achieve an 80% reduction below 2005 levels by 2050. And it covers all of the usual suspects: the large power plants, industrial facilities, refineries, chemical manufacturers, et cetera, et cetera. Smaller industries may be covered by sort of new source performance standards, like, if you have fairly significant emissions from a small boiler, you may have to meet efficiency standards, but it's not going to be part of a cap and trade. They haven't. One of the key issues here is, assuming we're dealing with a cap and trade program, the big issue there is how do you allocate these credits? Europe gave them away largely free. About 90% of all of the allowances that they wanted, they issued for free. And I'm actually a fan of allocating most of them for free. Henry Waxman and the new president-elect have said they want to auction these out. And I think that's a disastrous idea for a couple of simple reasons. One is it's the only way that you can assure that all of those costs get passed right on through the consumers, and you run the political backlash. And remember, the key is political and economic stability. And if you pass a bill that says, okay, industry, I need you to spend a couple of $1 trillion over the next 15 years, and you pass all of these costs through to the consumers, and the consumers start saying, hey, this is hurting, we don't like this, and you replace the current Democratic administration in Congress with a bunch of Republicans who ran on an anti-tax basis, and they repeal this, we're never going to get back on that horse again. That would be the worst possible solution. And so we really have to have a politically sustainable glide path as well. The other bill, and this is going to be interesting, Henry Waxman is now the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. It's arguably the most powerful committee in all of Congress because of the breadth of its jurisdiction and the fact that essentially it's so big in terms of the number of people on that committee that it is essentially a surrogate for the Congress, for the House. And Henry Waxman is not John Dingell. It'll be interesting to see. I'm actually kind of a fan of Henry Waxman's, but he spent most of his time investigating rather than legislating. And now he's in a leadership position, and he's going to have to show whether he can reach across the aisle and reach to the conservative side of the Democratic Party and put together a bill that can actually pass out of the House and clear the Senate, which is going to be a little more conservative. Henry Waxman's bill doesn't say much of anything. It's about 20 pages. And it essentially says, here's the goal. We're going to get to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, and we're essentially going to tell EPA and the president to figure it out. Well, that's not a good idea. That's, number one, not very democratic in my books. I don't like delegating hard decisions to bureaucracies any more than I have to, and that's essentially what this bill would do. Set big goals and punt it to the EPA to make hard decisions. I don't think there's a chance that bill would pass the Congress, and as a result, I predict that something similar to the Dingell-Boucher bill will become the markup vehicle, the basis and general framework for legislation in the coming year. Let's talk about regional programs. We have a lot of, for those of you who haven't been paying attention, there's a lot of greenhouse gas regulation going on right now. In the Northeast up here in the RGGI states, they had their first auction. Well, I'll go into a little bit more detail, but the green is the RGGI states. The orange is the Western Climate Initiative, and what's not shown here, and this is significant, is in addition to all those states, the dark ones are full participants, the others observers. There are also 4 Canadian provinces that are part of the Western Climate Initiative, which is a commitment to create their own cap-and-trade program internationally. And Mexico has become an observer with the idea that they may become a full partner, but at a minimum they will be a source of offsets for the rest of the Western Climate Initiative. The Midwest is still in its nascent stage, but this is an agreement amongst the governors of those states to start developing their own climate policy. All of these, by the way, started as a political tool to try to force Washington under the Bush administration to do something. They didn't actually want to regulate. They just wanted to embarrass the president to try to act, and I think they misjudged his resolve. And so now we have RGGI, in which they've done their first auction, and as Mr. Smotty noted, the first auction cleared at $3.07. That's barely a nuisance tax for the industry in the Northeast. The projections are that in about 2 or 3 days there's another auction of about twice the number of allowances, and it may go up to $4, but I don't think, given the recession and given the leakage problems in the Northeast, we're going to see the price go much higher than that. So it's not really going to have a significant impact. Now, in addition, well, here's the details. I just went over that, so I'm not going to belabor it. There's the Western Climate Initiative. The real key point is between RGGI and the Western Climate Initiative, if the U.S. did nothing else, about almost 50% of the U.S. economy would be subject to some form of greenhouse gas regulations. But it's going to be real uneven. RGGI doesn't look anything like the Western Climate Initiative. It's different in scope, it's different in severity of reductions, it's different in a lot of ways, and there's no way for the two of them to communicate economically or politically and try to make this a national program. And so what we really need is some sort of a national reconciliation. Because in addition, you've got separately California doing its thing, and they're being very aggressive under the governor. And in addition, you've got Florida, which has got an executive order which is committed to an 80% reduction below 90 levels by, it should be 2050 instead of 2005. New Jersey, which made the same commitment. Hawaii is trying to get to 1990 levels by 2020. And New Hampshire, which basically is irrelevant, but except for a political point, is saying you got to cap your emissions 3 power plants. So what happens if we have federal legislation? And the answer is we don't know yet. If Dingell-Boucher passed, they said we're preempted. No state, local or regional authority can impose a cap-and-trade program. So we would preempt the field if Dingell-Boucher passed. Waxman, on the other hand, says we're not touching anything. State can do anything it wants. And it's hard to predict where this is going to end up. I predict it's going to be closer to preemption because it's not going to make any sense to have regional trading programs that are going to be in parallel with and in addition to a federal program if the federal program has any teeth. And indeed, in the RGGI case, it's designed to go into non-existence. In the original creation of RGGI, it had a provision that says that we will blend in and cease to exist if a federal bill passes that is at least as stringent as RGGI, and any bill that passes will be at least as stringent as RGGI because it's not very stringent at all. So that leads us to the harder question. How do we get international harmonization? I'm not even sure what that means in some sense. I mean, we don't even have harmonization amongst the countries that are under the Kyoto Protocol. You've got the EU ETS, which sort of created their own regime in part so they could exclude Russia and the hot air from devaluing currency. And you've got Japan sitting around going, well, I'll take whatever I can get to buy off my emissions increases. I'm efficient anyway. And you've got Russia sitting around joining Kyoto basically on the promise that they get value for all of the emission reductions that they achieved as a result of the collapse of their economy. And so what is harmonization, and how is the U.S. going to participate? Well, we're not going to participate on the same basis soon that Europe has done in the EU ETS. And let me give you some good reasons. The EIA, the Energy Information Administration, put out its annual greenhouse gas inventory report just last week and reported that the U.S. emissions in 2007 had increased to 7.28 billion tons a year. That's 16.7% above 1990 levels. And our commitment under the Kyoto Protocol was to get to 5.3% below 1990 levels by the end of 2012. That's not going to happen. That can't happen. I mean, if you think we're facing economic crisis now, just what would happen if we all of a sudden reduced our carbon consumption by 20%? The answer is that can't happen. Can we, though, over a period of time, say to 2020 or 2025, merge the reduction commitments? And the answer is perhaps. Is it necessary that that happen? And I think the answer is no. And again, if you go back to that original slope of the path in which we need to get around 70 to 80% reductions, the key is to get on a long-term committed path in which the credits, the allowances that are traded here, have some common currency with the other emission caps that are out there, the European EU ETS and those allowances, or the Kyoto Protocol assigned amount units. So think about whatever the cap and trade is, there are common elements. You've got emission caps that are governmentally imposed. Well, we're going to have that. Europe's going to have those. Japan's going to have those. Hopefully some of the developed nations will have those sometime in the near future. You've got this allocation of allowances. Basically, it's a wealth transfer. Here, have some assets. Now go trade them, because you're not going to have as many as you need to function as you have in the past. And then this is key. There are going to be offsets from the unregulated sectors. And in the EU ETS and under the Kyoto Protocol, you have the clean development mechanism. And for those of you who are not well versed, the clean development mechanism is a process established by the UN whereby developed nation companies go into the developing world, call it China, and do a project that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. Say you go to a coal mine and you capture the methane that they're venting for safety purposes, and you capture that and generate electricity. You reduce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. You take that, run it through a very cumbersome and almost idiotic process at the UN called the Clean Development Mechanism, and they issue credits that you can then import into Europe and use for compliance. So instead of the EU issued credits, you have generated one by doing this technology transfer and investment in a developing world. And that's an offset. And offsets are pretty universal. We use them in the U.S. on a voluntary basis. We use them in Europe for compliance purposes. And once we get into the other markets, we'll be using them as well. So if you think about these allowances, these emission reductions as currencies, it's a little easier to grasp. So under the Kyoto Protocol, you've got what are called assigned amount units, AAUs. Call them allowances, call them credits, whatever you want to call them, but they're denominated as AAUs. But you can also use these CERs, the Clean Development Mechanism credits that are issued, or you can create what are called emission reduction units by making direct investments in the former Soviet Union. Under the EU ETS, you get European Union allowances. Same thing as assigned amount units, except that they're Europe's own little private currency. And they also allow, by the way, CERs to be used for compliance. In RGGI, they issue allowances, and guess what? You can use offsets there too at a certain price level. The New South Wales, they have their own currency plus renewable energy credits, plus they allow offsets. And the Western Climate Initiative is going to use greenhouse gas allowances plus offsets, and the U.S. program will, of certainty, have some allowability. And so what does that mean? It means there is a mechanism for currency harmonization, and that is these CERs under the Clean Development Mechanism. You know, we don't, I don't remember who was talking about it earlier. You have currencies all over the nation, and the currency markets do work reasonably well. Yes, you do have currency crises occasionally when an economy is going into collapse. And what happens? Well, the governments step in and they try to stabilize the crisis and avoid speculation. That's no different from here, and indeed, in some ways, this is a lot easier to control because the governments have control on both the cap and the supply of these currencies. And there's no reason why we couldn't have some sort of equilibrium price that starts to work to reflect the different stringencies of these programs that are out there. I'm hopeful that a lot of these little bubbles will disappear because we don't need to have the state and regional programs dipping into the same currencies. The financial industry is already way ahead of us on this. I've been engaged in doing swaps for EUAs and CERs in Europe. I've done forward CER contracts with insurance policies on whether these things are ever going to be delivered. We've got CERs backed by an EUA guarantee. We've done trust agreements between companies with CERs. I have to be careful here because it's not yet public. It's public, but it hadn't been listed. But there's a company that's creating a new commodity pooling instrument in which we, as retail consumers, can buy an interest in a futures value on European carbon, and that'll be listed like an exchange-traded fund. That'll be out any time now. But there is a very robust commodity market, and when you see that there's now the global commodity desk at Goldman and JP Morgan and all of the major banks, and their focus is not copper and it's not oil. The global commodity markets are focused on carbon. So when you've got all of the, bad timing on this, but when you've got the financial world looking at how to make this work efficiently, that's a good sign, and I think you're going to see that happening. These are the 4 exchanges that are up and running, although I think the green exchange is not fully up and running right now. That's going to be an exchange that I think has been announced but not yet created by the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which now owns NYMEX, which created that. The European Climate Exchange is the dominant market player right now. Blue Next and Nord Pool are two smaller traders. Nord Pool does this because they trade a lot of the electricity in Europe and are now commoditizing carbon as well. So what does the post-Kyoto world look like? Who knows? We saw some indication coming out of Poznan in the past 2 weeks in which we've seen some pretty strong commitments. Europe, not in Poznan, but they made the announcement there that they've agreed they're going to go to get 20% reductions from 1990 levels by 2020. That's a big commitment, and that's a lot of value that's going to be added to the carbon market when that happens. We're going to see U.S. climate legislation pass, if not next year, and probably not next year, by 2010. We'll see. You're going to see more aggressive commitments from both the developed and the developing world. At Poznan, we saw a lot of big commitments from Brazil, for example, who committed to reducing their deforestation by 70%. Little known fact is deforestation accounts for 20% of annual greenhouse gases in the U.S. in the world. And for Brazil to commit to a 70% reduction is a very, very large commitment because that is a significant driver in their economy. So we're going to see expanded technology investments, et cetera. And the question is, will the financial crisis affect climate legislation and regulation? The answer is yes, but it's not clear how. In the U.S., I don't think it's going to slow down climate legislation at all. In fact, if you see the rhetoric coming out of the Obama administration, they look at green technology and the greening of America as an economic stimulus, and you're going to see a lot of money poured into green investment. And indeed, if you think about it, I remember Mr. Smati noted that if we wanted to replace all of the coal plants with nuclear plants, it would cost us $1 trillion. That number's sounding kind of familiar, isn't it? Sounds a lot like the bailout we just committed to in the blink of an eye. And so it's not a lack of financial ability, it's a lack of political resolve as to whether we're going to get to where we need to go. So that's my talk, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to listen to Brian Turner, who will tell us more on California policies implemented in California.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And well, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you to the Institute and to Amy for inviting me. We in California are always happy to talk about our program, not because we think we've done anything amazing or that we've got the answer for everybody else, but I like to think because we are trying a lot of different things and we want others to join us. We want a lot of others to join us in trying out these policies and working towards solutions. So what I'm going to talk about today, I was asked to give an overview of what California is doing. I'll go into some depth on a couple of those policies that may be of interest here, talk about some of the evaluation that we've done, and then I look forward to the discussion we'll have. Hopefully be able to launch into some of the more interesting questions of market harmonization, how we'll interact with federal policy and international policy, because we certainly intend to. In fact, to talk about my position, it's a newly created position. I actually work out of Washington for the Air Resources Board and the governor, focused solely on this harmonization of the state climate policy with the federal and international. A little bit about why we're acting as aggressively as we are. The program that I'll talk about today is mostly our AB 32 goals, 2020 goal to reduce our emissions to 1990 levels. But that is laying the groundwork for the governor's executive order for 2050, an 80% reduction over 1990 levels. And we do this with some intention to create a model for national or international programs. Whether it's adopted or not is another question, and it depends on its success. But we are actively engaged in modeling. And the governor is one who believes deeply in the green technology, the green economy implications of transforming a high carbon society to a low carbon society. California's economy has always thrived on innovation, et cetera, and we believe this is one such area that will continue to do so. And lastly, the public health implications, which sometimes are glossed over in talking about climate change, but both mitigating the threat of climate change on public health, and it has some serious implications there, but also many benefits that we perceive from implementing our programs. For instance, one great example just in diesel exhaust. A lot of our programs will also affect diesel transportation in the state. Diesel exhaust is one of the biggest public health threats we face. So there are these co-benefits to our climate change programs. Too much text on this slide, but it talks about some of the impacts that we face. Water is one of the most severe. We have the most valuable agricultural program in the state. We're going to face some very severe water availability problems, which will affect that industry. We rely on our snowpack as a natural reservoir, and with climate change, we'll see more rain, less snow, significantly less water availability. That'll also affect our hydropower and our ecosystems. Sea level rise with 850 miles of coastline. California is very subject to sea level rise. Quite a few low-lying communities in the Bay Area and Southern California, as well as quite a bit of infrastructure along the coast that will face erosion impacts. Also, for those of you that know the northern Central Valley of California, much of it is protected by levees along the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta system, and those will, they're already have some vulnerabilities, but sea level rise will significantly exacerbate that, and that not only will impact our agriculture again, but also many communities that have grown up in the Central Valley, and we'll have to spend billions of dollars either protecting those levees, or we'll face some significant public safety issues. Forest fires, if you've seen the news, you've seen some of our impacts with forest fires. The governor recently said forest fire season in California, which used to be a 3-month period, is now basically year-round. We have spent billions of dollars each year fighting our forest fires, significant public health and public safety impacts, and that may just get worse. And again, air pollution impacts of climate change. I started this timeline in 1824 to talk about the origins of climate change, but I also include a bit of discussion of California's long history of air pollution regulation. It was one of the first places that smog was discovered and air pollution agencies were established. The California Air Resources Board, the organization I work with, has one of the longest and most distinguished records successfully fighting air pollution. So I put this out as a context to how we're approaching the climate change problem, which is with significant scientific and regulatory expertise applied to the issue. And you notice in the 1990s, it was mostly a study period, and in the 2000s, we have started to really aggressively apply the programs, starting in 2000 with the California Climate Action Registry. I call that out. That's a public-private partnership where certain early action companies started to register their emissions and their emission reductions. And it laid the groundwork for emissions registries that will hopefully, many companies and states currently have adopted this accounting method, and hopefully will be adopted by the federal government as well when we have any day now an official registry program for the federal government. And you see the governor's executive order establishing our goals, and it was in 2006 that we passed AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act. The AB 32 Global Warming Solutions Act was one of these varieties of climate legislation that is as bare bones as you like to make it. It set the goals that we will achieve 1990 emissions by 2020, set certain principles for the program that we'll adopt, that it should be the most economically efficient but maximize the co-benefits that we could achieve in public health, that it will have a robust stakeholder process. But it didn't identify the policies that would be put in place, and it left that to the California Air Resources Board to come up with. So that is what the Air Resources Board has been doing. In 2007, they came out with a list of certain good ideas that they knew they wanted to implement immediately, including the vehicle standards, the Pavley vehicle standards, the low carbon fuel standard. But then the majority of their program has been developed and incorporated into the scoping plan, which we adopted just Thursday, officially adopted this vision of how we will achieve these reductions. And I'll talk more about the scoping plan. Those early action ideas will start to be in place in 2010. The majority of our other programs, including cap and trade, will begin in 2012. So the scoping plan, just approved last Thursday. It is a mix of strategies with a cap and trade program over 85% of the emissions, but then within that and outside in the other 15% of emissions that the cap and trade doesn't cover, there are specific regulatory programs addressing specific sectors. Many of these have to do with identified market barriers or other economic market failures that we believe profit by addressing directly. For instance, the very well documented problems with adopting cost-effective energy efficiency measures, where where the investment is daunting or where you don't have the information to access it. So we've addressed market barriers in energy efficiency directly and not left it to just a cap and trade program overall. So cap and trade program and then existing slate of programs. This slide gives a bit of a description of the challenge we're facing. The blue line indicates our emissions overall and where we are committed to going. And the yellow bars are per capita emissions. So it is a very significant challenge. This is a graphical representation of what the scoping plan intends to do. The first bar is our business as usual, both the sectors in which we use from which the emissions occur, and then in the middle is a list of the programs that we are pursuing under the scoping plan, the AB 32 program that we've just announced, and the final bar is where we're going to. So in the right-hand side bar, the major purple section is what is covered under the cap. And then there are some programs in the uncapped sectors, agriculture, high global warming producing gases. And yes, there are 18 individual programs in addition to cap and trade. I'll be discussing some of the highlights of them. First of all, cap and trade, like I said, it covers 85% of emissions. This is the electricity sector, transportation fuels, natural gas. We heard some about the Western Climate Initiative already. Those are the states that are part of it in 4 Canadian provinces. It's almost becoming not so Western anymore now that we have got Quebec as one of our members. So it's becoming quite large. And all the Mexican border states are observers as well. The Western Climate Initiative is really something interesting to study as an analog or a model for international cooperation in many ways. Each state has adopted their own targets. And then the Western Climate Initiative's overall target is the aggregate of those. So we didn't go to Utah and dictate what kind of emissions reductions they should shoot for. We obviously were engaged in negotiations, but their target, they devised themselves. We added together with ours to come up with the region-wide goal. And that's 15% below 2005 levels by 2020, which is roughly equivalent to California's goal of 1990 levels by 2020. The certain issues are going to be able to be decided by each state, how much money they want, whether they will auction their emissions allowances or not, or give them away for free. If they do auction them, what they will do with their revenues. In California, the politics of this are still developing. We have not committed to any of the specifics of the cap and trade program yet. That'll be in 2012. But we certainly hear a lot that we should move as quickly as possible to 100% auction, use as much of the revenues as possible, either to mitigating the costs on consumers in some way, especially low-income consumers, some kind of rebate or some way to mitigate their costs. But for sure, spend it on those technologies that reduce emissions, renewables, and energy efficiency. The last slide there is a point that we've made, a political and an economic compromise to not include petroleum and natural gas used for home or commercial use, as in natural gas outside the electricity sector. That will not be in the cap and trade program until 2015. So it'll be a phased-in approach. The first sectors will be electricity and major industrial. I want to just give a few highlights of our individual measures. The Pavley vehicle standards, named after the California state senator that introduced them. You've probably heard plenty about this. This is the California vehicle program that we have had an ongoing fight with the federal government and with the automakers now for good 4 or 5 years. And we are optimistic that we will continue to win that fight with an EPA waiver that will allow us, and the other 13 or 14 other states that have committed to also taking on the program will be able to do so sometime soon in the new administration. President-elect Obama has pledged to get us that waiver. It's one of our most cost-effective regulations because of the fuel savings over the lifetime of the vehicle. Consumers will save thousands of dollars even over the cost, any increased cost in the vehicle. We also then have a number of other transportation measures. I'll mention the ports and goods movement measures. This is one where we're dealing with the both the vehicles, the marine shipping, vehicles in the ports, and then the heavy-duty trucks going in and out of the ports. We hope to reduce, we'll make all those vehicles more efficient. We hope to reduce diesel exhaust emissions at the same time because the ports and the heavy-duty trucking are in low-income areas. This is also one of the most significant public health measures that we are able have done in quite some time. So it's a great example that I like a lot of the co-benefits that we're expecting. Low carbon fuel standard, I gave some more detail of this because I was coming to Houston, and it is an oil industry oriented regulation. Generally speaking, it requires each fuel provider in the state to reduce the average greenhouse gas intensity measured over the life cycle, well to wheels or farm field to wheels basis by 10% by 2020. This is not generally occurred by actually reformulating a fuel, but more in the overall fuel mix that a provider sells. So perhaps selling a little less gasoline, a little bit more low carbon biofuels will bring down the average over time. But notice it's not actually a cap on the transportation sector. So if you were experiencing phenomenal growth in biofuels, you could both sell more gasoline and more biofuels and still reduce your average overall. It includes credit training, and electricity and other currently small providers of alternative fuels can opt into the system if they can prove they use it in transportation, and they're a low carbon source. Then they generate credits and can trade into the system. This is all based upon life cycle analysis, the well to wheels approach. So if you are a fuel provider of a basic type of fuel, gasoline, corn ethanol from a typical natural gas-fired corn ethanol plant, you'd have a default value that you would use. You would be able to use the federal renewable fuels standard numbers that you're given in that system for accounting in California system as well. But if you are a small biofuel firm or a major fuel provider that buys from a small firm that has a unique process and that has a very low carbon number, you could apply to have that value, a unique value given to that fuel. And lastly, there is this issue of indirect land use change, which we are continuing to evaluate, and will probably be an additional greenhouse gas emissions charged against any crop-based biofuel or biofuel that uses arable land, and this is because of the tendency of using arable land anywhere in the world to increase demand for arable land everywhere in the world, thereby increasing the expansion of cropland and some emission of some deforestation somewhere in the world. It is a difficult process to analyze, quite controversial. The theory of it is rather unassailable. The practice, extremely difficult. So we're still working on that one. Our energy efficiency programs, this is where we pose a lot of stock. We've currently an energy efficiency strategic plan. We intend to beef that up considerably and aggressively pursue it. Why one of the reasons energy efficiency is one of the favorite programs is that we believe this is also one of the most cost-effective things we can do. California has been a leader in energy efficiency for 30-some odd years. It's an interesting story about California's regulatory environment that we do have one of the highest electricity consumer rates in the country, some of the highest consumer prices in the country. Our average consumer bills, what people actually pay, is one of the lowest in the country. And this is, I think, highlights the effect of energy efficiency. People consume less. So despite that their rates are high, being more efficient allows those costs to be generally low. We've got a very high renewable portfolio standard at 33%. We're in the process of rulemaking for this currently. That will also be a market-based program. California Solar Initiative, 1 million solar roofs, is a heavy subsidy of the solar industry actually in California. But I'll highlight the last one there, regional VMT targets. And this is the bane of urban planners all over the country and all over the world, that land use planning is a local activity, and yet the regional impacts of transportation occur to the region and the state, and there's no process for regional or state planning. This is initiating that. It will not dictate local land use, but it will use a scenario planning process for a region to identify targets for reducing the growth in VMT, vehicle miles traveled, basically personal car travel, for a region, and then apportioning that to each of the cities. And it will be complicated about how this is, how cities and localities will have to comply with this, but it provides incentives to those that do. It's an incentive-based program. If you comply with your regional VMT targets, you will have certain streamlined permitting for certain types of projects, exemptions from our Environmental Quality Act, our mini NEPA Act. So it's an incentive-based program. There is no heavy hammer, just carrots. And this is a selection of our measures in the uncapped sectors, so in oil and gas extraction. In our forests, 1/3 of our state is forested. We intend to increase the rate of sequestration, standing carbon above baseline. We will increase the amount of landfills that capture their methane and turn it into energy. And we'll also encourage that at dairies. The dairy industry is one of the largest in California and one of the largest in the country. So we'll increase methane capture there. Our preliminary economic evaluation basically shows it at a wash in the state, that we actually show some modest increases in both jobs, gross state product, individual income, but they're so modest, and we're projecting economic growth over 12 years that it really should be called just a wash. Much of that comes from the efficiency measures, where we are saving money from consumers, both domestic and the automobile efficiency measures, that then is reinvested in the state. It's more money in people's pockets and therefore more money in the economy. Energy savings, another major goal of the program, of course, is petroleum security. So we're reducing gasoline and diesel consumption. The public health benefits are very significant. So we just adopted the scoping plan. Which gives the overall vision. It does not do any of these specific regulations. We'll be developing that over the next 2 years, and those will be put out in 2011 for enforcement in 2012. And we're one thing for a federal modeling that we've discovered to be very important was the interagency coordination and coordination with the local governments. That the Air Resources Board was given a lot of authority basically to bang heads where necessary between our agencies and our local governments to just bring them to the table, get people's ideas and commitments flowing. And that will be very important if we're ever going to get a federal program going with the stovepiping of programs within the federal government. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now it's going to be the turn of Mr. Sass.
Now, where is this magic button? There it is. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and talk to you and with you. I was very impressed by what I've heard so far today, noting that primarily what you were talking about was mitigation of this problem. You led me to believe that perhaps what I had to say is irrelevant, because what I'm talking about today is adaptation to the greenhouse gas changes. Now, you heard Neil Lane this morning say that we were going to have an increase in temperature. It's inevitable. So far, about 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade until about a 2-degree rise in 2050. In order to get a 1 to 3 degree rise, you need to have a concentration of about 450 parts per million. We're at 385 parts per million today. 450 would simply about double the pre-industrial value of 280. So this is not beyond high probability of happening. On the other hand, with a little perturbation on that and a little less success with mitigation, we could very easily go to 550 parts. 550 parts per million is a temperature change between about 3 and 4 degrees Celsius, and that makes quite a bit of difference. For example, if we held the concentration to 450, which I believe is almost the bare minimum of what's going to happen, we'll get not any less than that. We'll have severe impacts on marginal lands such as the Sahel, other desert conditions, disappearance worldwide of mountain glaciers, and consequently threatened water supplies to a great deal of people, coral reef damage, and increase in intensity of storms, forest fires, droughts, floodings, hurricanes, etc. Now, compare that with going to 550. So I go to 550. The IPCC predicts that we'll have falling crop yields in many developing regions, leading to partial starvation, and in some cases, extreme starvation. We'll have changing water availability, which will affect more than 1 billion people by 2050. We have possible onset of the collapse of the Amazon rainforest. Now, that's hard to believe, but the Amazon rainforest could very easily suffer from successive drought and progressing drought from the coastline inland. We'll have many species facing extinction, and the intensity of storms, forest fires, droughts, flooding, and hurricanes will continue to increase. Therefore, it seems obvious to me we do have to worry about adaptation to these problems. There we go. Now, I just essentially covered this, but just to remind you that we have causes on their various sectors which have various effects. The sectors being food, water, ecosystems, and severe weather conditions. You can see the list that I gave you is essentially represented there. And there. Leads to the idea that global warming should have adaptation stress just as well as mitigation. Now, the stressing of mitigation is kind of an old story. I've quoted from Al Gore twice here. In 1992, he says, adaptation represents a kind of laziness, an arrogant faith in our ability to react in time to save our skins. That is to say, he favors mitigation essentially completely. In 2007, he says, we really have to focus on prevention, which by that he meant mitigation. On the other hand, there are emerging ideas from other sources. The UNFCCC, Article 4.1b, formulate, implement national, and where appropriate, regional programs containing measures to facilitate adaptation. Article 4.4, assist developing countries, parties that are particularly vulnerable. And Kyoto Protocol, Article 11, commits parties to promote and facilitate adaptation to address climate change. So you can see there, internationally, adaptation is gaining as an idea. And not that it will replace mitigation, but will be companion to it. Mitigation efforts alone cannot avoid, therefore, further impacts of climate change, and adaptation will be necessary. Now, a wide array of adaptation options are available, but more extensive adaptation than is currently occurring is required. We are now in the process of adapting to various situations which can be attributed to global climate change. You'll notice in the list that I gave you, the severe weather conditions are severe weather conditions that we now experience, and we do adapt to those. What I'm saying, though, is that through global climate change, through an increase in temperature, I believe that you will increase the energy supply to the atmosphere, destabilizing the atmosphere, causing additional strong atmospheric events, and thereby increasing the severity and intensity of the natural disasters we currently face. So this to me suggests the need for a portfolio or mix of strategies that includes not only mitigation but adaptation, new technological advances, and research. I'm a scientist, so I have to put in research. Therefore, governments must manage the incentives for both individuals and corporations to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. Now, what are potential adaptations? Well, you can modify the hazard. And I gave as an example, cut fire lanes or clear flammable bush. Prevent or limit the impact. Build a seawall. Dam rivers and reservoirs. Excuse me, Galveston built a seawall several years ago. Seawall says that the surge from a hurricane will not exceed 17 feet. Well, if you increase the intensity of hurricanes, it's very possible that that seawall will no longer be adequate. What will Galveston do? Build a new seawall? Build a higher seawall that is currently existing? Or give it up and move off the island? Now, I would suggest the best possible solution there is give it up and move off the island, because I think it's almost criminal to build on a barrier island like that. What do? Well, a lot of people own a lot of very expensive property down there. Buy them out. Reestablish the wetlands in that area and go from there. Now, that's very radical. But on the other hand, if you consider the idea that 1 foot of surge gets dissipated by 1 mile of wetlands systems, that would suggest that if you had a 19-foot or a 20-foot surge, the first 20 miles of the coast are going to be inundated, at least to 1 foot of water. Personal experience, I have a brother-in-law living with me since September. He was taken from his house, or his house was taken from him by Hurricane Ike. He lived in San Leon, which the eye passed directly over. I don't really consider this personal hardship on my part, but it certainly is on his. And that then includes move to avoid the loss. Share the losses. That is, provide flood insurance. Well, that doesn't work very well, as we know, do we? The government does supply flood insurance. If you can get a hold of the government to get a hold of the money, to get a hold of a piece of property. My brother-in-law, again, got from the flood insurance people the idea that they would give him a voucher and he could move into a one-bedroom apartment while he was getting his house renovated at the tune of about $30,000. He went around to several apartment buildings in the area where he lived, and nobody would accept a voucher from that organization. Enough said. Therefore, bear the loss. Take one's chances on a probable risk factor. Bet on a favorable statistical outcome. Well, we do that all the time. After all, the hurricane has hit Galveston only twice now in the last century. Probably won't hit again for another century. Therefore, I will build on the island and go on from there. Okay, we have climate change, natural and anthropogenic. Our reaction to that climate change is to look at the initial impact and effects, formulate additional adaptation, look at the remaining or net impact, that is, how much of the impact have we taken care of by our adaptation, and those impacts give us adaptations that are impact-driven or vulnerability-driven. Having done that, we look at the policy responses. What do we do? Where do we go from here? Well, we maybe ought to mitigate. So we drive the will, the urge, the policy towards mitigation, which then leads to additional human response. We get additional climate changes, and we go through the adaptation process again. Until finally, we might have to do additional adaptation. So it's an interactive flow diagram here that we need to look at in terms of adaptation and mitigation together. Now, there are thresholds in the gradual change going to abrupt catastrophic changes. The Earth system is generally considered to be stable, which is one of the problems that we have with public opinion on global climate change. The Earth may not respond to the current climate change in that way, however. Now, we cannot wait for science to exactly define the thresholds of change, although science is trying very desperately to do that. What is the tipping point beyond which, if we go, we will never return? Beyond which, if we go, we will melt Greenland, which, by the way, is extremely catastrophic. And I'm not sure how we would adapt to that. After all, the sea level rise, 21 meters, right, would inundate New York City and most of our coastal cities, all of our coastal cities, 80% of the population, large cities of the world. We might have a shutdown of the thermal haline circulation, which Neil Lane alluded to this morning. So subjective thresholds generate conflicting response views held by risk takers, risk-adverse individuals, and risk makers. Our population is divided into those three groups, and we act accordingly. However, all countries need to have intelligent and effective leaders and advisors who will work together to prepare all nations to deal with the consequences of climate change. Here is a representation of a probability curve, this normal bell curve, for a particular value of climate attributes. So this climate attribute could be the temperature, or it could be the intensity of storms, whatever you'll have. There is a most probable value, and there is a coping range between those two side vertical bars. To go outside of our coping range gives us the upper probability of high extremes, very low probability in this case. If we shift the climate, we shift the curve, and the probability of that happening increases tremendously. And that's our problem with adaptation. We're used to that little bit. A little shift will give us a lot of change, a lot of problems with our adaptation. Governmental policy decisions generally are in response to crisis situations. Everything human beings do is in response to a crisis situation. Governments are no different. Climate change is often so slow and incremental that we don't elicit immediate governmental action. The benefits of short-term actions overshadow later costs. I'm going to build a bridge. I make it so high, the water is flowing under the bridge. It cost me $5 million to build a bridge. I could have built it 2 feet higher, let's say, for another $200,000. I didn't spend it. Climate change comes along, probability goes up, the water goes up 2 feet more, 3 feet more, my bridge is underwater. What do I do? How do I adapt to that? Well, I could build a new bridge. Or I could lament the fact that I didn't spend the $100,000. Unless, what does a new bridge cost me? If, say, I don't have to build that new bridge until 2050, and it only cost me $10 million then, and I have saved $100,000 to begin with, what is the marginal cost in 2050? Is it the difference between $5 million and $10 million? No, it isn't quite. But those numbers are simply arbitrary. So there is a risk analysis that one has to put into this, and no matter what you do, I don't think you're going to be able to take care of the whole risk. You're going to have to make an informed decision. Now, I want to look at a particular example here. And this, of course, is us. Hurricane Ike hit us in September. The damage from Hurricane Ike is now estimated to cost between $13 and $21 billion. So as long as we're talking about cost of adaptation, this is the cost of the hurricane. Estimates include $10 billion to $15 billion for winds and storm surge on the coast. Ike could then become the third costliest storm in U.S. history after Katrina and Andrew. Look at the poor guy in the middle picture, for example. He's not caring particularly about cost right now. Here's the extent of Ike. This is an aerial photograph, actually a satellite photograph, with the coastline of the Gulf Coast superimposed upon it. You notice that it ranges all the way down into Mexico over to well into Louisiana. This is a huge storm. We had a problem around here because it was a Category 2 storm when it hit the coast. Category 2 because categories say what is the velocity of the wind in the hurricane. Other people are criticizing now that that's not a good measure. Well, if you think about it, the energy of the atmosphere, if I remember correctly, my high school chemistry and physics, is that the kinetic energy is 1/2 the mass times the volume times the velocity squared. So the energy in the atmosphere is proportional to the square of the velocity. Therefore, the various hurricane scales. On the other hand, there's a mass term in there. And what the mass term says is the bigger the hurricane, the bigger the mass. Well, you say the bigger the hurricane, the longer the coastline that it's going to intercept. But the coastline is linear, and the mass of the hurricane is area. So there's a distance squared versus a distance there, and the distance squared wins out, and the larger the hurricane, the bigger the effect. The intensity of the hurricane is dependent upon the on the temperature difference between the surface of the water and the top of the atmosphere. During climate change, the top of the atmosphere is not changing temperature tremendously, but the surface is. If I increase that's Carnot's cycle for those of you who are physicists. Neil, are you gone? Yeah, he's gone. It's Carnot's cycle. If I increase the temperature of the water by 2 degrees Celsius, I increase the amount of vapor going into the atmosphere by 15%. That increases the energy of the atmosphere by 15%. it increases the wind velocity by something like 7%, because remember it's a square term. But the mass can get larger because the whole Gulf can be that hot. So believe me, I think it's almost inevitable that we were going to go to higher and higher hurricane velocities and energy content. Here is a before and after picture of Bolivar Peninsula, which is right across from Galveston Island. You notice there's one house standing. That house was built in 2006. The reason it's standing is that it was built to withstand a hurricane of force 3. The whole first floor is gone. You don't see that. There isn't one. The foundation is this far above the current level of the sand that washed out from underneath it, but the house stays. So that house adapted to what's going on. The rest of them that you can see in the lower right-hand insert are no longer there, taken out by the surge. Here's a picture of, nice picture actually, of Galveston Island. You can see Bolivar on the other side of the pass there. You can see the Texas City Dike coming out and Texas City. Now the hurricane that came through here, or Ike, had a 13-foot surge. A typical Category 4 might have a 19-foot surge. Here's the result of a 19-foot surge on Galveston Island. And surrounding territory. So what did we learn from Ike? What did we learn from Katrina that we applied to Ike? The successes were that between the two hurricanes, we had adapted by having rapid field deployment to conduct evacuation. You may recall that during Katrina, Houston evaporated. Houston evacuated even though it didn't have to. It was a mess, terrible mess. So we made fuel available along the highway. We had fewer breakdowns and bottlenecks. We had active engagement of law enforcement along the whole route. We had cooperation amongst all these agencies that are involved. We had problems with the evacuation of special need people who had to have bus transportation out of the area. You recall one of these buses caught fire and everybody on it died because they took their oxygen bottles with them and one of the oxygen bottles ignited. Well, now each convoy has at least one tracking device on it so that authorities know during Ike, where every bus was. Not that it always did them any good, but if the bus was headed for San Antonio and they could see that and they got a call from San Antonio saying we're full, they could divert the bus within 2 minutes to go somewhere else. So evacuation worked an awful lot better. Each evacuee was registered on site, issued an ID bracelet, scanned, and put onto the manifold or manifest of the bus. Not the manifold, the manifest of the bus. Accurate hydrodynamic models forecasted regional storm surge vulnerability, and vulnerability is a very important part of adaptation. And exceptional post-event documentation of the impact is available for additional analysis. However, there were also failures. Inefficient coordination of the supply chain. That is, we had the trucks full of supplies. They never reached their destination. Our mayor, for example, got very, I'll say, pissed off at FEMA because the distribution points were set up and no truck got there. He shouted around for a while and finally the truck showed up. Coordination between the federal and local government. Ineffective communication to isolated populations. If you lived in Galveston, you got warned. If you did not live in a large town, chances are you weren't warned quite as well. Even though radio and television were there, the intensity of warning from the local law enforcement agency was not there. Once you got out of town and you were ready to come back, nobody told you to come back. Prolonged loss of electric power. We had loss of electric power in some cases for over a month. the need for a better predictor of hurricane surge, and the slow and inefficient response by federal governmental agencies. So we need to rethink it. That's going back in the loop and readapting our adaptation. Now, one of my former graduate students, who now works for civil tech engineering, modeled the difference on Harris County as a, do I have to stay with this one, Amy? I say I better stay with the microphone, I guess.
Well, for taping now.
Okay. Anyway, I left out category 4 because I didn't have enough room. But categories 1, 2, and 3, and 5. Now, if you look at the total building structure exposure, Harris County has $244 billion worth of buildings. This is commercial and residential. That's 868,176 buildings. I guess she counted them all. Look at the expected damage to a building as the category increases. Category 1, a little over 1,000. 2, 16,000. 3, 165,000. 5, 686,977. Huge difference. Ike was a category 2. Notice the functional ability of fire stations, hospitals, police stations, and schools. Not so bad for a category 2. They're still all functional. Although that's not quite right. The 2 houses in Galveston burned during the flood, and the fire department could not get to them because they were flooded. So it's close. But notice how it goes down in a category 3 and how it really drops for a category 5. Building loss. Again, category 2, we're losing 585 buildings. Category 5, 51,000 buildings. Excuse me, that's millions of dollars. I beg your pardon, I misread that. That's $51,980 million or $51 billion. Now, $51 billion is a lot of money, even today. If I'm going to adapt, is it worth for me to adapt to save $51 billion? Finally, look at the debris. 7 million cubic yards for category 3, 1 million cubic yards for category 2, and we were inundated in this town with debris. You get up to a category 5 and it's 44. And then finally the number of people who need shelter goes up tremendously, from a very small amount for a category 2 to over 56,000 people for a category 5. Now, that's one storm that had damage over $1 billion. Here are pictorial diagrams of billion-dollar weather disasters in the United States from 1980 to 2007. Now, there are a lot of them, as you can see. But what I think comes out to me mostly is that the type of disaster is regionalized. And we have a very specific region, the red circle is the hurricane sign, a very specific region of hurricanes traveling all the way from the coast of Texas up to the coast of North Carolina. That would suggest to me that there ought to be a regional response to hurricanes. And that regional response should include those states in that region. Now I'll go out on a limb. I noticed today in the paper that New Hampshire had a very bad ice storm, and they sent in the National Guard to clean up the debris. They sent in 300 National Guard people. Well, it's nice to have a reserve of people around to do things like that. Why not train them? Why not take our National Guard, and instead of having them do field maneuvers to fight a war, we can do that too, but why not show them what to do in case of a hurricane? If we're down here. If they're in the West, what do you do in case of a forest fire? And so on down the line. So I'm proposing that one of the adaptive measures that the country could put in very quickly, use an existing body of folks, the National Guard, divide them up regionally, which may be the problem because that would involve multiple states, and train them to the disasters of that region with the expectation that when climate change comes along, the adaptation you're going to have to do in that region is just an intensification of what you've already done. That way, it's a win-win. If you don't have climate change, if mitigation takes care of everything, you're still around to take care of the current type of disasters. On the other hand, you're quite well equipped to do the other if indeed there is climate change. Another way of looking at that is simply to notice the number of events per state. And the Southeast is heavily invested in events. Texas, the whole area there. And most of those are the hurricanes. Remember, these are just those natural events that cost over $1 billion. Doesn't include all of them. So, adaptation to the dangers and vulnerabilities of climate change. What do we need to do? Harden local and state infrastructures to withstand natural disasters of increased intensity. Provide for assistance to individuals and communities to lessen the effect of natural disasters on the economy. Anticipate and provide solutions to problems associated with public evacuation, injury, and death associated with natural disasters. One thing we haven't talked about yet at all was prepare for a climate change related public health issue. That would refer primarily to high temperature events like the heat wave in Chicago in '95, for example. Promote an awareness of the potential loss of biodiversity, something we normally don't think about. How about those other guys out there, the other species, who have a very increased probability of going to extinction? And prepare for the impacts of climate change on the translocation of geographical distribution of forests and grasslands. For every degree rise in the temperature, our forests will have to migrate 300 miles to the north. How much will it cost? I haven't the slightest idea. It will not be optimal to adapt to eliminate an entire climate effect, averting all dangers or removing all risks. That simply is too expensive. So there have to be some choices made. And very little is known about the aggregate extent of the cost of adaptation, but I found some rough estimates. One estimate was that adaptive costs would be about 0.2 to 0.5% of the world GDP. That's about $70 to $150 billion a year. On the other hand, Munich Re, the reinsurer, the world's largest reinsurer, said it probably will run about $300 million or more to adapt. According to the latest IPCC report, total costs for climate change will run between 1% and 5% of the GDP. However, towards the end of the century, excessive sea level rise could increase adaptation costs to up to 10%. And other abrupt climate changes would have equal or greater impact. Mitigation is expensive. Adaptation, in my mind, is as expensive or more so. To do them both together, one ought to find an optimal path. And to do that, we need a better understanding of the fiscal cost of adapting to climate change at a personal, local, regional, country, and international level. Thank you from Galveston Bay.